What's up, everybody? Michael Walsh here. So I've got kind of a fun topic today and a bit of a big picture topic, and it is why are bigger fighters so much worse than smaller fighters? Because we talk about lighter man skill all the time, and when we make pound for pound lists where we're comparing fighters as far as like who would beat whom if they were all the same size and had their current skill sets, who's coming out on top, we always favor the lighter fighters. And why is that? For my money, there's four main reasons. But only two of those reasons really get brought up ever when I see people address this topic. So I wanted to lay it all out because, if anything, the two other answers that I never see addressed or very rarely see addressed, they might even be the bigger explanations. Because even if we solved for the other two, I think we'd still see a skill gap between lighter and bigger guys. So starting with the popular answers, I think the one you most often hear is that, especially in the United States, the larger athletes are just off doing sports that pay way better. So, in the US, our heavyweight athletes are primarily playing football and basketball. Those are the popular sports. They're the sports everyone plays. They're the sports that pay the most money. And they're sports where lighter athletes won't excel. Sure, for certain positions, like quarterbacks aren't that big, for example, but in general, someone like Jose Aldo just can't play American football. Whereas, the football field and the basketball court are just filled with guys who, if they wanted to, had devoted their life to martial arts instead and to combat sports, they'd be some of the best heavyweights we'd ever seen. So that's one reality. And it's very true. A cool thing about combat sports and about any sport that has weight classes is that it allows for athletes of different size to compete. Because other sports that are sort of open weight and don't have any, there is no weigh-in process, you just show up, those kind of sports are going to naturally select for people whose body type fits the sport. And in many cases, that's a large body type. So obviously football and basketball, but even sports like volleyball, selects for tall people. And you can, if you're interested, you can kind of Google this stuff. You can look up what's the average height of a volleyball player in the Olympics, what's the average height and weight of a tennis player in the Olympics, etc. And not all sports select for giant people, but many of them select for large people. And only a few sports select for more average or even smaller size people. So association football, or soccer as the civilized world calls it, that selects for relatively small athletes compared to other sports. You're not going to see a Francis Ngannou playing soccer. But and soccer is the most popular sport in the world. And soccer is where someone Jose Aldo, who did play soccer recreationally, someone like him could do a sport like that, whereas he couldn't do American football. But nevertheless, that is one of the main reasons we just don't see great heavyweight athletes. And it's why when you see a Francis Ngannou, when you see a Brock Lesnar, when you see a Tom Aspinall, it's actually special. You're actually holy shit, we got one. This isn't just a big lumbering oaf. This guy is actually an athlete. The second reason is that most human beings just aren't that big. It would change based on whether you're looking at the global population or whether you're looking at certain regional or national populations. But the average human being is somewhere between a UFC bantamweight and a UFC welterweight. And I mean with the weight cut. So what I'm saying is the average male adult is probably going to be somewhere between 150 and 190 pounds, would be my guess. Now, whatever that range is, the average human being is just not going to be 6'4" and 250 pounds. Okay, it doesn't matter what population you're looking at. And because of that, it's a smaller pool, which means the tippy top, most genetically gifted, athletic freaks of that pool, it's just going to be a smaller, less elite number. And you see that not just in the population, but in the actual competition pool. So if you just look at the UFC roster and you look at the number of fighters in each division, there are more fighters in the lightweight division than there are in the heavyweight division. I didn't check before this video, but I'd wager it's twice as many. And so again, to be the best athlete of twice as many fighters means you're probably a better athlete. So some of this is just unavoidable in that sense. Even, and by that I mean, like, if every athlete in the world just did MMA, so all the heavyweight athletes were also doing MMA, you'd still just see better and more athletes at a higher level in the lighter divisions. And the better fighters would still probably be lighter just because there's more of them, Now, those are the two more common explanations. Now, the other two explanations that I think get overlooked, the first is, like, heavyweights, like, physically can't move as well. It's more difficult to move in a coordinated way the more that you weigh. So what I mean by that is, like, even if you are athletic, even if you are Tom Aspinall, it just takes more effort and coordination to do things. So, like, even something as simple as throwing a right cross, where your weight has to shift forward onto your lead leg, your hip has to turn, your shoulder has to turn, you have to coordinate that with, like, the extension of your arm, and you have to do it in a way that generates a shitload of force and speed, but which doesn't throw you off balance, which doesn't throw your head way past your knee, etc. And doing that combination of, like, shitloads of force production, moving your body but not overcommitting, not throwing yourself off balance, that's harder to do when you weigh 260 pounds than when you weigh 170 pounds. It's just more mass. It's more shit you have to move, and it's more shit you have to stop moving once it's moving. So that's just naturally more difficult. And that's only like compounded when you're doing more, like, fancy techniques. So, like, if Tom Aspinall wants to throw a spinning heel kick, that's just more, that's more mass that can get thrown off where, he misses the kick and he lands out of position. Like, that's just more likely to happen to him than it is to happen to a featherweight, just because of the physics. Even if they're equally good athletes with equally good innate talents, equally good proprioception, etc., they've both been training equally long, it just will be harder for the big guy to do that technique than it will be for the lighter guy. That's just physics. And the fourth and final reason is that heavyweights just can't train as much. And there's several reasons for that, but, like, one of them is simply they will get tired. So if Francis Ngannou is doing, 8 rounds on the heavy bag, he's gonna be more exhausted at the end of those 8 rounds than will a lighter guy, because, again, he's moving more mass. And not only will he be more exhausted, but he'll have thrown less strikes. So, like, and that's true across, like, combat sports. That would be true in boxing. If Anthony Joshua works the heavy bag for 8 rounds, and if Floyd Mayweather works the heavy bag for 8 rounds, Floyd will land more punches every round and more punches in total than will Anthony Joshua. Because he just can. He's lighter, he's quicker, he can do it. He can throw more punches in a shorter amount of time without getting as tired. And that adds up. That means workout after workout, week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade, that's all the more repetitions. That's all the more good practice that he's getting in that Joshua isn't. That's all the more good practice that someone like Jose Aldo's getting in that someone like Tom Aspinall is not. And there's other, like, logistical problems that come with being that size. So, like, if you are Francis Ngannou and you're sparring, you're in a dicey kind of situation because you can't hit the guy as hard as you'd like to. If it were a fight, you've got all of this thunderous power to use and to rely on. But when you spar, you can either, like, kill your sparring partners or you can pull back a bit, which is what you have to do, in which case they're not going to respect your power as much as they realistically should, which means it's harder to, like, develop and apply your game in a realistic way when you're sparring if you're that big, because you just can't use your power the way you would in a fight. And sure, that means you should, like, work on your skill more because you can't just knock everyone out, but it also means that you're not getting realistic reactions, So it's like, in one sense, it encourages you to work on your technique, and in another sense, it's not actually prepping you for what's going to happen. And that's just much less of a problem for lighter fighters, who also have to pull punches. It's not like a featherweight can just throw 100% when they're sparring, but they can throw closer to 100% than someone like Francis can. And in the opposite direction, someone like Francis will just take more damage sparring. If Francis spars with someone his own size, even if they're going kind of light, they're just each taking more impact with every blow, and that can be to the head, it can be to the body, it can be when wrestling, there's just more likely that it's more likely that injury will occur if they're like shooting takedowns on each other. And that like affects multiple things. Like that affects how you do your conditioning. Like Daniel Cormier talked about this. He's like, look, a lighter fighter can do more sport specific stuff for their conditioning. So like if you watch Alexander Volkanovski do his conditioning, it's extremely sport specific. It'll be 5 rounds of him like mixing up where he'll be like working the pads, and then randomly when he's not expecting it, Craig Jones will like come up behind him and grab him, and now they're wrestling and he's fighting the hands and he's getting mat return and he's getting back up, and then it's striking again, and round after round of that kind of stuff. And that's very good because the conditioning is specific to the sport, and you still get some skill work in because you're still actually hitting the pads and wrestling and whatnot. You're getting used to using your technique while you're tired. Whereas Cormier pointed out, the heavier you are, the more likely that is to hurt you. If you're, and Daniel Cormier is not even that big of a dude, but imagine like a proper heavyweight like Derek Lewis or Curtis Blades or Volkov or someone like that. If they're doing 5 rounds of that kind of shit, when round 5 comes around and they're exhausted and they're still defending takedowns from another big dude, that's the kind of situation where your knee gets blown out. You know what I mean? So they can't do as much of that stuff, and instead they have to resort to things like doing 5 rounds on the Aerodyne bike or something. And yeah, that's an okay substitute, but it is nevertheless a substitute. So it means your conditioning won't be as good because you can't do as sport-specific conditioning. You're getting less reps in because every 5 rounds of Aerodyne bike you're doing is not 5 rounds of, takedown defense and pad work and shit like that. And you're not as used to like using your technique when you're exhausted. And since you're already going to get exhausted more quickly because you're heavy, like all these things combine to just make you look worse as a fight happens. Makes you look worse come the actual event when you're fighting for the title. And so for those reasons, like we could have a world where everyone was just doing MMA. And even there, like again, you'd expect the lighter guys to be a bit better because there's just more lighter people than there are giant people. But even if you could account for that, like even if we could live in a hypothetical world where there were just as many guys Francis Ngannou size as there were guys Jose Aldo size, they would still run into those second 2 problems, which are, again, like the physics are just such that it's harder. Like someone like Francis Ngannou just can't be as coordinated as someone like Jose Aldo or someone like Conor McGregor. Again, assuming they're of equal talent, assuming they've done an equal amount of training, the bigger guy just can't be as coordinated. And additionally, they're just more likely to get injured. They're more likely to get injured training. They can't do as many reps because they're going to get exhausted. Doing the same kind of workout, they will get more exhausted more quickly, and they just won't be able to do as many reps to get to that point of exhaustion. And connecting to that exhaustion is they can't actually do as sport specific and as intensive stuff for their conditioning work because, again, if you are 270 pounds and you are exhausted, you're in the last minute of a 5-round like conditioning circuit, and some fucking behemoth is trying to blast double you off your feet, you might get hurt. So for all these reasons, it's just not realistic to ever think the lighter men won't have more skill. And that's okay. It is just a trade-off. The lighter guys have more skill, but the heavier guys would beat the shit out of them. And that's why no matter what, no matter how sloppy and ugly the heavyweight division is, and no matter how much on average the fights might suck, we're always going to have a special reverence for the heavyweight champion because deep down we know that he'd beat everyone else. And if he wouldn't, he'd only lose to like the light heavyweight champion. So it's like, it's never going to be the case that the lightweight champion in the modern era, it will never be the case that the lightweight champion can beat the heavyweight champion. And the best guy in the world will be either the light heavyweight or heavyweight champion. It will be some big guy. It's always going to be your Alex Pereira, your John Jones, your Francis Ngannou, your Tom Aspinall. It's going to be those guys who can beat everyone else, who are the actual, who's the person who's the actual baddest man on the planet will be a guy like that and will not be Ilia Topuria. and that's just the reality. So it is what it is. Like the physicality, the attributes that you get with being heavier that allow you to beat people smaller than you comes with the trade-off of just being less skilled. And yeah, that means on average, the fights in the lighter weight classes are better. But again, we're always going to care about the heavyweight title. We're always going to care who's actually the baddest motherfucker who, in an open weight situation, would beat everyone else. Because if MMA were open weight, like if MMA and other combat sports had no weight classes, you wouldn't see a lot of light fighters. You'd see some, and they could have some success, and you see that in open weight grappling. Yeah, I mean, we saw, of course, Demetrius Johnson beat that heavyweight brown belt in the Pan Ams or whatever it was he was doing. But generally speaking, you're not going to see that. Generally speaking, the Gordon Ryans of the world are just never going to lose to the Marcelo Garcias of the world. And generally speaking, again, there's been exceptions in the past, in the earlier days, like Sakuraba beat Kevin Randleman and Rampage Jackson, but even he still got smashed by Crow Cop and guys like that, Wanderlei Silva. And yeah, of course, Hoist Gracie and dudes like that beat bigger dudes because they couldn't grapple. But in the modern era where guys actually know what the sport is and are training, it's just not happening. Like, you're not going to see Alexander Volkanovski beat Alex Pereira. Okay, it's just not happening. It's never going to happen. And and that just is what it is. And that's why all the divisions are worth keeping around. And that's just the nature of the sport and the nature of the human body and the human population as it pertains to sports in general. So that's what I've got on that.